Good morning, everyone. My name is Margaret Myers. I'm a senior advisor to the Inter-American Dialogues Asia and Latin America program. Thank you all so much for joining us for today's event, either in the morning hours on the East Coast of the U.S. or from wherever you may be across Latin America or in Asia. This event is called Views on the China-CELAC Forum, and it's being co-hosted by the Inter-American Dialogue and the Fundación Andrés Bello. The fourth ministerial gathering of the China-CELAC Forum was held just last week in Beijing, marking the 10th anniversary of the founding of the forum. In addition to welcoming ministers from the Latin American and Caribbean regions, there were also some Latin American heads of state in attendance and some noteworthy announcements, which, if we're able to interpret correctly, may help us to understand how China and Latin American nations view their relationships, especially at a moment of considerable global flux. We are very fortunate to have an all-star group of experts with us today to help us interpret the forum's proceedings. Parsifal de Sola is the co-host for this event and also founder and executive director of the Andrés Bello Foundation, and specifically its Latin American Chinese Research Center, which is an independent NGO in Bogota that conducts in-depth research on China and its impact on the Latin American and Caribbean regions. Claudia Trevisan is executive director of the Brazil-China Business Council and was a journalist for many years, including extended stints in China and the United States. Claudia was at the forum just last week, so we're very much looking forward to her observations on proceedings. Ning Lung is an assistant professor at the Georgetown University McCourt School of Public Policy. She conducts research in comparative politics with a focus on political economy, political institutions, policy process, and Chinese politics. And finally, Eric Olander is the co-founder of the China Global South Project, the much-watched and much-loved nonpartisan media initiative dedicated to exploring all facets of China's global engagement. These experts will each provide some brief observations of last week's events, and then we'll move into a Q&A session. If you have questions for the panel, please do send them using the Zoom Q&A function. We'll address as many of those as we possibly can over the course of the hour. And with that, let me turn to our experts for some commentary. Parsifal, would you be willing to get us started?
Thank you so much, Margaret, and to everyone joining us and our co-panelists. I'm not going to take much time, but I would just like to highlight, I think, two of the overarching themes that we saw at the forum. I would say that there's this dual approach from the PRC that was pretty present throughout the forum. On the one hand, you have the multilateral fora that the China-CELAC Forum represents. And on the other one, you have this bilateral approach where you have increased engagement, in this case with Colombia, Chile, and Brazil, which were the countries that the heads of state participated. So on the multilateral fora aspect of this, we saw a continuum of what China has been doing for over a couple of decades now, trying to drive to promote itself as a leader of the global South, of, let's say, the countries outside the traditional West. Western countries. So we saw the usual talking points: promotion of multilateralism, anti-hegemonism, promoting the agency of each of these countries, and again, there's with China as one of the main defenders of this portrayed coalition of countries. And this is very much in line with what we see coming out from the foreign ministry, from Chinese diplomatic corps across Latin America and Africa, Southeast Asia. And there's always, there was an important subtext which is always there, but this one was a little bit, this time around was a little bit more pronounced, which was anti-US positioning, especially given Donald Trump's last 2 to 3 months, and it's well, change in tone and foreign policy, especially in Latin America, but given tariffs and much more proactive, a much more aggressive and sometimes coercive foreign policy coming out of Washington, this was clearly present at the forum. On the other hand, the bilateral side, this was much more concrete. From the forum perspective, it follows the line of the previous ministerial forums. It's very symbolic. It's China does a splash with all those pronouncements, and an important detail to highlight is that not only the talking points, the framing, phrases like the common help me out here, Margaret. It's the
Community of common destiny.
Community of common destiny. Yeah, thanks. So it's this type of framing. It was clearly that China was the one, setting the tone, and all these country representatives were, following and repeating those cues. And well, again, going back to the bilateral side, that's where actual things got done. Colombia mentioned in its cooperation with the Belt and Road Initiative. We had Lula with this huge delegation, which was actually quite impressive. 9 ministers plus business elite also accompanying the president. Chile was more or less the same, not as impressive as the Brazilian delegation, but again, it's clear that both Brazil and Chile went with a purpose, and was precisely to, within the framing of the forum, have these bilateral private talks with their Chinese counterparts and actually get things done. So to summarize, you have the very symbolic aspect of this, the China-CELAC Forum as the umbrella, and then you have the practical aspect of it, which was more at the bilateral level.
Thank you so much, Percival. Let's turn to Claudia.
Hi, Margaret. Morning. Thank you so much for the invitation for being here today. It's a pleasure to share the panel with Lynn, Parsifal, and Eric. I know very much Eric's voice because I'm a regular listener to the China Global South, but it's the first time I participate in an event with him. And I'd like to focus more on the participation of President Lula and also the Boric and Petro. As Parsifal mentioned, I think their presence increased the political weight of the forum. The Chinese side insisted a lot on the participation of President Lula. He represents the largest economy in the region, and the fact that he was there, I think, gave a stronger political weight to the meeting. And the statements of both Xi and Lula were very much aligned in the defense, as Percival mentioned, of multilateralism, criticism of protectionism. Both used the same expression in their statements, that trade wars have no winners, and they defended a global system of fair trade based on rules. Lula said the region do not wish to be a stage for hegemonic disputes, neither repeat the history of the Cold War, while Xi Jinping said bullying and hegemonism only leads to self-isolation. There was a strong emphasis on South-South cooperation, And in the joint action plan that was signed in CELAC, there was a pointed criticism of unilateral coercive measures that can affect economy, trade, and investments. And I think it's important to highlight also that there was a strong defense of the global climate efforts and a reference of the importance of COP30 that will be held in Brazil in November. And I think it's obvious that all of this represents a criticism of the United States position, both in the unilateral adoption of tariffs and in its abandonment of the Paris Climate Agreement. Another issue that I think is important and that Percival mentioned is the increasing adoption of Chinese diplomatic concepts, both in bilateral relationships and in CELAC. And I think the most important one is the Community of a Shared Future that appears in the title of the CELAC Declaration. And last year, when Xi Jinping visited Brazil in November, both countries elevated their relationship to the level of a community with a shared future for a more just world and a more sustainable planet. That kind of mix the Chinese concept of community of a shared with a shared future with Brazilian efforts to combat poverty and promote climate policies. And besides participating in the China-CELAC meeting, President Lula made a state visit to China. It was his second state visit to China since his inauguration in 2023. And in his remarks to the press, he said that the relationship between Brazil and China has never been so necessary. As Percival mentioned, Lula went with a big delegation. Actually, he had 11 ministers, the president of the central bank, the president of the Senate, and about 10 representatives and almost 200 companies that went in the business delegation. If we look at the period from November, when Xi Jinping came to Brazil to participate in the G20 and made the state visit, to July, next July, there will be an intense, a number of encounters or meetings with Lula and Xi Jinping. They met in the G20, in the bilateral visit. In May 9, both were in Moscow for the celebrations of the Victory Day. And then Lula came for the CELAC, had the state visit, and in July, Xi Jinping is expected in Brazil for the BRICS summit and possible also a bilateral meeting with Lula. And I think there is one topic of the bilateral agenda that is of interest of the whole region, which is the Brazilian plan that is called South America Routes of Integration. This is part of the 4 strategic plans for Brazil's development that was mentioned in the document that was signed when Xi Jinping was here in Brazil in November. That is the document that established synergies between the Belt and Road Initiative and Brazil's plans of development. And during Lula's visit in China, this one of the aspects of the South America Routes of Integration, which is the bi-oceanic railway connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific. It was mentioned by Lula, by his chief of staff, and by the Brazilian Minister of Planning, Simone Tebet. It's a very challenging and difficult project, but it's worth mentioning that she said that both China and Brazil will discuss the feasibility of this this project in the next 30 days. So let's keep an eye on that. I'm very skeptical about it, but the Brazilian government is talking a lot about the bioceanic railway. And I think there was a lot of symbolism in the CELAC, and in the fact that China was able to promote the event in the current increase of geopolitical competition with the United States. And I'd like also to mention the visa exemption that China announced for citizens of 5 Latin American countries: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Uruguay, which I think is a gesture that has a lot of symbolism. And to end, one area that I think is a new area of possible cooperation between the region and China is finance integration. There was an event on the 14th with the presidents of the Brazil and China central banks. And one of the discussions was the emission of panda bonds, bonds that are nominated in RMB by Latin American countries in China. Last year, a Brazilian company, Suzano, which is a great export of pulp to China, they issued the first panda bond issued by a company from South America. And they managed to get a very competitive rate since China is lowering their interest rates. And it is, in this event, they talked about their experience, and there was an encouragement for other Latin American companies to issue bonds denominated in RMB in the Chinese market. That's all.
Fascinating, Claudia. Certainly a lot to unpack there in our Q&A. Let's move on to Ning.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for inviting me. It's so great to be here with my fellow panelists. So I think what I could offer is do a little bit comparison of the two main documents coming out from China-CELAC this year, the Beijing Declaration and then the Joint Action Plan, and compare that to what in 2015 in the inaugural, ministerial forum, what they produced, and compare that to what China's Latin American policy has been since 2015. So here's what I noticed, particularly on the front of economic cooperation and soft power. So let me say a little bit about economic cooperation first. There is a usual focus this year and an increasing focus on infrastructure and agriculture cooperation. I think this is very natural considering that China needs to export its construction capacity and China needs to diversify its trade portfolio away from US and Europe. But there are several new things that I thought was very interesting. So the first one is, I think, reflecting a weakened Chinese economy, is what is the amount of the credit line that China offered to the Latin American region. It's only today they're offering $9 billion. It's a much smaller credit line compared to 2015. In fact, the amount is less than half of what China pledged in 2015. So I thought that was really reflecting a weakened Chinese economy. And then the second new change is exactly what Claudia was talking about. It was the panda bond. So I will just add a little bit onto what Claudia already said. Think about panda bond as this is a bond issued by a non-Chinese foreign entity. It could be, say, the Colombian government. It could be, say, exactly like the Brazilian corporation. Now, these foreign entities issued a bond in China, and then Chinese investors come out to purchase these bonds. Now, there's a very peculiar policy condition on panda bond, which is the investment and the proceeds of panda bond should only be used inside of China. In other words, this is a really smart policy invention of the Chinese government in that it's going to tell the Chinese investor to invest backed by a foreign issuer's bond, which is a very secure credit product. And then all of this money produced in this transaction will be used in China alone. So what I see from this is two things. Number one is not just that Latin America will need Chinese investment. Today, China very much sees Latin America as a source of investment in China. Now, in the past, Panda Bond is usually issued to developed countries and developed country companies. But right now, China is expanding it to Latin America, showing that China sees a lot of future and economic hope in this region. And they're hoping to get capital from Latin America into China. So I thought this also reflects a weakened Chinese economy and the strong desire to integrate China and Latin America's financial network. And then the third thing I noticed is that there are mention of, more cooperation on green energy and technology. The language here is vague, but I couldn't help but wonder, when it comes to tech and green energy cooperation, is China and the countries in Latin America region thinking about the same thing? So President Petro gave a exclusive interview to China's national TV network after CELAC on CCTV. And from what he said, he was really hoping to catch up, right, for Colombia to catch up on the front of innovation, on the front of AI, hoping for technology transfer from China in cooperation. But from the Chinese perspective, if you think about energy and tech cooperation, most of the time China is thinking about exporting. Sell more solar panels, build more hydropower, nuclear power plants, sell more EVs, more electronic products. China is thinking less about investment and technology transfer into the region at this point. So I think this would be an interesting area to see if the two sides could find a common ground and whether they would, make both sides happy rather than disappoint each other. And then, so that will be a little bit I would say about the econ. And then I also noticed some changes in China's soft power language. So one very interesting thing is the emphasis stays the same. It's people-to-people exchange. China is pledging a lot of opportunities for people-to-people exchange. However, the core idea here is based on the numbers that China put out on how many people they're going to invite to China, the scholarship they're going to offer. The core idea basically is quantity is the most important thing to China. So at this forum this year, China offered 5,000 government scholarships to the region over 3 years. If you look at this number, compare that to what China offered 10 years ago in 2015, this number is in fact slightly fewer than what they offered in 2015. However, what China did increase is the number of short-term training opportunities this year for professionals from the region and broaden the scope of training. So from professionals in government affairs to professionals in technology, agriculture, and Chinese language. So this is suggesting that China is aiming for a more cost-benefit effective way to bring in as many people as possible from the region to learn about China and to cover a much broader range of industries and sectors in Latin America. And then I'm also curious to see a new front of soft power by China. So a new thing that China proposed this year is that China will introduce about 10 Chinese TV shows per year into the region. I thought this is really interesting. It reflects how China is trying to model after United States and even South Korea, like in this day, in exporting pop culture. Now, traditionally, Chinese pop culture's international market is basically limited to a few countries in Southeast Asia. So for Chinese TV shows to enter Latin America, I think it will be interesting to see how successful they are. But in general, China does not seem to be stepping up in areas similar to, international aid or U.S. aid does. So disaster relief is mentioned this year, but not any more than how China mentioned it 10 years ago. Same with poverty alleviation. There's no noticeable increase or detailed specific number offered on the Chinese side. But the only thing that stands out to me, just from eyeballing all of these documents, is more talk on the Chinese side about promoting gender equity and empowering women in Latin America, as well as sharing their land reform experience to Latin America, particularly in Colombia. And these are very specific and unique Chinese experience. So I find that also interesting that they are offering that. So I'll just end it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ning. Let's move on to Eric.
Okay, I'm batting cleanup today, and really what an honor to be here with everybody. And thank you, Margaret, for the invitation. I'm going to take a slightly different tack than my colleagues on the panel today. And I'm going to express that I was quite surprised by what happened at CELAC this year. Given the fact that the Western Hemisphere now is the primary focus of the Trump administration in their confrontation with China, and really to exert pressure on Central and South American governments to sever their ties and curtail their ties, and given the importance that this region has for China, $515 billion of trade, that's almost twice as much as what they do with Africa. It's half as much as what they do with Southeast Asia, their largest trading partner. But the trajectory of trade is definitely going up. And South America obviously presents one of the most important markets to absorb some of the excess capacity that the Chinese are producing and are now getting increasingly contested in G7 markets. And so I was expecting on the Chinese side to have a much more robust engagement. Let's not forget that last year at FOCAC, China turned out a $51 billion financial package, combining export credits, loans, combining training, all sorts of things, very diverse. Just last month when President Xi Jinping was in Southeast Asia, they talked about an $8 billion railway between Haiphong and Guangxi province. So the Chinese, even though the economy is weak, as Ning pointed out, they are still talking in strategic areas about big packages. And so given that context, and given the importance and really the primacy of Central and South America in the great power competition with the United States, where Xi is really concerned about not looking like he's being bullied out of the region the way that he was in Panama, that I thought they were going to come out with a very robust package. And $9.6 billion of export credits is, really, I mean, as Ning pointed out, it's even meager by the previous standards of CELAC. It really did not show a seriousness on the part of the Chinese that they were going to compete, at least economically. The other thing which we see in other fora, either the Mideast fora and Africa, and also here in Southeast Asia as well, is a lot more bilateral deals on the sidelines of these conferences. And so what accompanies these conferences not only is the main release, but also one release after another of this country, did this and this country did that. We didn't see any of that. And that may be in part because the seniority of the attendees at this year's ministerial gathering was not as high as in previous gatherings, as a lot of countries wanted to keep their senior ministers home and on the sidelines, and just out of concern of potentially angering the United States. But that was another surprise. I was also surprised on the South American side. I don't quite understand what Gustavo Petro is doing. He is 1 year out from an election where you can see the campaign ads now being written up by the agencies in Bogota saying, we're going to right the ship and put the trade relationship back where it should be with the United States. I mean, Colombia does $40 billion of trade with the United States and about $20 billion of trade with China. So the economics of joining the Belt and Road at this moment in time, in this contentious moment of time, is a little bit perplexing, given the political risks that it potentially poses to Gustavo Petro, and given the fact that this is going to provoke the United States. And in fact, just this weekend, we had another confrontation where the embassy in Bogota threatened to cut off funding for development projects that involve Chinese state contractors. And Petro's attitude was, go ahead, if that's what you want to do. I think there's a misreading potentially on the part of Colombia as to what's going to happen when he joins the Belt and Road. And Honduras right now kind of stands out there as a model potential that not a lot. Money doesn't come raining down from Beijing as soon as you sign on the dotted line. So it's coming at great political risk, both for Petro, but also for Boric as well. He's up against re-election, and then they're up against conservative forces there. And I think if anything we've learned over the past couple of years is that someone like Javier Milei can tell us that you can be very much aligned with MAGA and still keep a robust economic relationship with China. And I think that's going to be the blueprint that a lot of conservative politicians on the continent and the region are going to run against people like Boric and Petro for fear that they have alienated the United States and gotten into a contentious relationship with the United States. So again, a lot of surprise on both sides that this wasn't as robust a CELAC as I think the moment called for. And that was my big takeaway. So I'll end there and looking forward to our discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Eric. We have much to discuss over the rest of the session, and a reminder to participants to please submit your questions through the Q&A function in the Zoom in order for us to be able to answer them in sequence. But allow me to ask just a few initial questions of everyone, if you don't mind. I'm going to ask three, and please feel free to respond to any that strike you as particularly appealing. But first of all, I mean, just in listening to your interventions, it struck me that the framing that we're seeing, which is very much of the moment and reflective of clear concern within the Latin American region and in China, right, about the nature of relations with the United States, about, broad support for multilateralism, isolationist tendencies, broadly speaking, globally, right, and real critique of U.S. policy in all of these areas, but that the framing itself was not all that different from what we saw during, Trump won. At that moment too, right, there was a real emphasis on multilateralism, a real emphasis on trade integration, right, and on a rule of law, certainly, but rule of law in the international order, reinforcing a lot of these institutions that China has become a member of. And so I wonder if, between Trump 1 and this current administration, this current moment, we see anything strikingly different in terms of China's tone. Obviously, there are certain products, certain offerings, right, that China is mentioning. The panda bonds are one, right? But of course, renminbi internationalization was a very big part of this, of the Chinese narrative and Chinese efforts even back, 10, 12 years ago. So has China become more innovative at this moment, or is this a repeat in terms of messaging of the experience during the first Trump administration? The second would be, on this notion of certainly you've all mentioned, or many of you have mentioned $10 billion or $9 billion, right, being not all that much in comparison to what we've heard of in the past. I was just speaking with Eric prior to the session, and we mentioned that not all that long ago, Argentina itself, right, had received a commitment of upwards of $25 billion to $30 billion, for a wide range of projects, be it in the form of investment or credit. This is $10 billion tops, right, in credit, not necessarily specifically in investment, which is unique and interesting in its own right. But I mean, what can we expect concretely, do you think, in terms of, these are obviously promises, some of it may materialize, some may not. Where might China focus? And if this $10 billion does come to pass, what kind of projects or other initiatives might we expect China and Latin American countries to focus on? And then a third, just to not overwhelm everyone, but the panda bonds, this was mentioned a couple of times, and it is striking because now it has, I think just as was mentioned, more general support in the region. It's always been part of the Chinese narrative. There's always been an interest in promoting renminbi internationalization through various mechanisms, be it through currency swaps or denominating loans, portions of loans in renminbi. There are lots of mechanisms through which to introduce China's currency and encourage its utilization. But these panda bonds seem to be resonating more extensively with governments in the region, or at least there are those that are taking them up, right, rhetorically, and promoting them more broadly. Should we expect a real shift in greater interest in use of the renminbi for wider ranging transactions at this moment when there has been real critique globally, I think increasingly so, of US dollar dominance in the global economic system? So what does this mean? Where are we headed with this, and what does it mean for the US dollar? And so I'll leave it at that, and then perhaps we just go let's go in reverse order this time. And Eric, any of those you'd like to address?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to my final point too, the curiousness of the lack of robustness of the package, and again, strong on rhetoric. I think Claudia made a nice outline of the ideology of the final statement, but very, very weak on actual tangible commitments. Now, we can start to kind of think about why they might have done that. Now, this might have been something that was requested by the CELAC side too, saying, listen, if we put too much money on the table and there's too many things that the US can then kind of circle around, that's going to bring unneeded heat that we don't want right now. That is a possibility. I mean, I think the rest of the panelists may have some insights on that I don't. Also, maybe the Chinese, again, this region, this is not one that they want to spend as much money on. As you said, Argentina has, was a big risk that they've taken, and they've had a long, tortuous history with Argentinian credit and finance. Venezuela, of course, is famous for losing tens of billions of dollars. There's a lot of people gun shy, probably, about engaging Latin America at the China Exim Bank and China Development Bank, given some of the kind of the difficulties that they've faced previously. Also, again, we've seen what happened within Panama. We also saw in Mexico as well, where Claudia Sheinbaum really recognized that she had no other choice but to lean into the relationship with the United States. And so, again, does China want to fight this battle right now against the United States when it's got its hands full with its bilateral challenges with the United States? That may have been a consideration that she was undertaking. So I'm just trying to understand, to your point, Margaret, why the package came out so kind of tepid when, again, in other regions, we have seen far more robust packages and engagement strategies. That's still very puzzling to me.
Absolutely. And that comparative perspective is essential in terms of understanding how all of this is playing out. Thank you so much. Let's go to Ning.
Yes. So regarding the first question, back in 2015, if we look at Chinese documents, like general policy documents away from CELAC on how to describe their position in Latin America, they always bring in United States, not by name, but they would say, we're not here to challenge other great powers. We don't mean to replace anyone. But this year, when I look at the CELAC, the Beijing Declaration, for example, that kind of language is dropped. Rather, it's emphasizing, and this resonates with what Petro and Lula were saying in China, right? There should be an independent path carved out for these Latin American countries, and China is there to help them find their independent path. So I thought that was a more confident tone on the Chinese side, and they now understand more better like what the countries in the region want. And in terms of credit line, I absolutely agree with Margaret. It's small, and you're absolutely right. But there are other things. For example, there's trade and there's investment. Basically, I see this shrinking of credit line. Partly, yes, it's weaker Chinese economy. Part of it is 10 years in, Chinese government started to realize that Latin America is not Africa. It's not even, Central Asia. It's actually China had plenty of difficulty here pushing for government to government lending. And so realizing there's a limit, like a lot of these countries are more fiscally disciplined. So China partly maybe have that consideration in mind as well to shrink the credit line. But they will definitely want to invest more in natural resources, particularly the new portfolio of natural resources that will fund, fuel China's current manufacturing, which are the new materials. So we'll talk about lithium, copper, gold, magnesium, all of these are in Latin America. I think there will be more interest in that. China will continue to be really interested in increasing their presence in construction and infrastructure in this region, because this will be a region that could afford it. So China needs to export not just roads, bridges, but they're also interested in solar panel farms, hydropower plants, and this region has that demand and they could afford it. So I think China will continue to increase investments in those. And then finally, just briefly, Panama. Panama is such a weird product in that the proceeds have to be invested, like preferably. They relaxed it in 2017. But Chinese government says preferably it should be reinvested in China. That alone is quite a deterring condition to many institutional, issuers of bonds. So I don't think at this point it would threaten US dollar per se, but I guess we will have to just watch.
Thank you so much, Ning. Yeah, and it was striking to me. It was not only on the Chinese side, but on the Latin American side too, that you saw this real effort to, chart a course, and in these speeches you heard this, especially from Lula, right? I think you mentioned, Ling, that it was Claudia who mentioned that the relationship with China has never been so necessary, but at the same time he said we're walking our own path, right? That's not fully dependent on the US and not fully dependent on China, right? So this emphasis on really diversifying partnerships is something I think we're seeing on the Latin American side and have for a long time. And then, of course, China seems to be picking up on that. I think that's a really, really critical point, Ning, in terms of its own messaging. Let's move to Claudia. And Claudia, I mean, if you would like to also comment on this Peru-Brazil Railway and its prospects and why you think it's, a long shot, that would be really helpful. And certainly this is resurfacing now after almost 10 years of being latent, and people are interested in whether this is moving forward in any real form.
Yeah, I really don't know. I don't have the answer to that, but it is something that the Brazilian government is very much interested in. And Ning mentioned Petro's interview to the Chinese media, talking about innovation. And I think there was, from the Brazilian perspective, I think there was a kind of frustration also in the bilateral agreements, that there was an expectation from the Brazilian side that there would be more announcements, especially in infrastructure. And I think there is also, we talk about different perspectives, from the Chinese side and the Latin America or the Brazil side. And there was an interesting part of Lula's speech in CELAC, in which he said it's necessary to reduce asymmetries between countries. And it's essential that the collaboration between CELAC and China contributes to the strengthening of industry and innovation in the region. So from the Brazilian side, I think there is this expectation that China, through investments in the region, will contribute to reduce these asymmetries, either on industry and also in technology development. And I think areas of new cooperation between the two countries that were present in at least in the Brazil-China agreements is cooperation in infrastructure, but also in digital economy, innovation, artificial intelligence. And although we did not see, we saw a lot of announcements of memorandum of understanding of cooperation between Brazil and China in these new areas. And also, I think it's important to notice, we talked about technology transfer. And one of the CELAC announcements was the creation of a center for technology transfer between China and Latin American countries. We don't know yet what it entails, but there was also an agreement in this area between China and Brazil. Regarding the panda bonds, I think there is also this difference in expectations. I think from the Brazilian side, the expectation is that panda bonds will be a channel for Brazilian companies to raise capital in China, but be able to use this capital in Brazil. And I think the example of Suzano, it is this first company from the Americas that issued panda bonds in China. It was last year. And they were able to use the resource in Brazil. They issued RMB denominated green bonds. And I think the main appeal for them of the Chinese market was the fact that the interest rates are much lower than the interest rates in Europe, the United States, or in Brazil. And they were able to raise money with an interest rate of 2.8%, which is very competitive. And they managed to make the conversion of this money directly in reais and use the money in Brazil to they use it for the how they call that? It's basically to renovate land that's being deforested to plant commercial trees that then they use to manufacture of pulp. So I think from the Brazilian side, the expectation is that it will be Brazilian companies will be able to issue panda bonds in China, but be able to use this money to investments in Brazil. And I know also that there is a discussion about the issue of sovereign panda bonds, like from the countries from the region, the treasuries from the region, to issue panda bonds in RMB, but obviously to be able to use these procedures to finance the governments on the original issuer of the bonds. And I think this, when Xi Jinping came to China last year, both countries created 2 task forces to deepen their cooperation. One task force is very broad and includes infrastructure, ecological transition, routes of integrations, industrialization, and the other one is financial integration. And they are looking not only to panda bonds, but also to stock exchanges, to the issue of ETFs in both countries, and to use of local currency and other things that can deepen the finance cooperation. But I think it is challenging. It's not obvious that the emissions, the companies that issue panda bonds in China will be able to repatriate the resource. And I think that is one issue of negotiation right now between Brazil and China.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Let's turn to Parsifal, and then we have a number of really excellent questions in the Q&A that we'll get to. And Parsifal, if you have any thoughts on Petro and his decision making and what of all of this, the joining of the BRI means, for the U.S.-Colombia relationship or the China-Colombia relationship, that would be most welcome.
Sure thing. So Colombia, and to Eric's comments, it's not only you. No one knows what Petro is thinking. We are a Colombia organization, and we engage regularly with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I can tell you, no one really knows what Petro is thinking. So, without getting too much into detail, odds are that the best explanation for Colombia deciding to join, and important difference, they didn't join. They more or less followed the Brazilian approach. The wording is not, Colombia joins the Belt and Road Initiative. Colombia will cooperate with the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think that's an important difference, which stems from some understanding that this would, that there will be some kind of repercussion coming from Washington. But overall, odds are this stems mostly from domestic politics. Petro is in a very tough situation nowadays. He needs a win. We will come into elections in the next, election cycle in the next few months. This is like an easy win that really doesn't need much implementation. It's just, an announcement, it's an MOU, and sort of like will portray Petro as doing something internationally. And this is common knowledge in Colombia. I don't know so much outside Colombia, but Petro, throughout his presidency and before, has always been this figure that has tried to portray himself as a Latin American leader, and that this was an important stage on where to portray that kind of image. So several of my co-panelists have mentioned that why the weak proposal from China? Well, I think there's an important context here. CELAC is not ASEAN. CELAC is no focal. CELAC is actually an MOU. There's no central institution to promote CELAC at a regional level. The only the institution that actually does have like regional legal binding agreement is the Organization of American States, which is basically CELAC plus Canada and the United States. CELAC is nothing of the sorts. It has always been a symbolic platform, which we cannot negate the fact that this was actually spearheaded by Hugo Chavez in Venezuela back in the 2000s. It had a strong ideological anti-US stance. And nowadays, CELAC is even weaker in any sort of promotion of Latin American integration. So I think China finally acknowledged the fact that this is basically a symbolic platform to make grand gestures, but not where things get actually done. And that's why I mentioned this dual approach, where the things that we did see that have concrete results were done at a bilateral level, mostly with Brazil. So yes, we cannot compare CELAC to ASEAN or any other of these, regional institutions that are well established, that do provide channels for China to make concrete proposals. Well, to Ning's comments about the soft power approach, and she mentioned that one thing that caught her attention was an increase in people to people engagement. I think there's a reason for this. I think China is aware that when it comes to its public perception, how Latin America's, this varies widely across the region, but we can. It's a fair assessment to say that China does not have the best reputation across the region for historical, ideological reasons that we don't need to get into. But I think this is part of it. This is, China's approach of engaging at a people-to-people level, getting officials to visit China, to study there, to provide those people-to-people links that eventually will pay off down the road. Those are my few comments.
Thank you so much, Percival. Let's turn to some of the questions in the Q&A. Both Tulio Cariello and an anonymous attendee have asked about whether the panelists can delve into some of the sectors in which China is extensively engaged at this juncture, not just in Latin America, but in other parts of the world. Energy, electric vehicles, and other areas where tech is being brought to bear in support of certain development objectives, especially in the energy sector. There's a lot happening. Are there any thoughts on whether the U.S. has something of a counteroffer or response? Are we seeing China just making massive and unchecked advances in these areas? So perhaps I could direct that question to Claudia and Eric, if you have any thoughts. And a sort of corollary from Esteban Caballero is, any thoughts on the so-called weaponization, right, of the Inter-American Development Bank in the hemisphere, or concerns that a lot of the financing going for projects is being utilized or benefiting mostly Chinese companies, Chinese construction companies. Any thoughts on that narrative and what what the U.S. in particular, from a policy perspective, might do about that? So anyone who would like to comment on that, please also do so. One question here, and I'm just going to mention this, and we'll go in order and kind of address those that are of interest, is on Argentina. Is Argentina's renewed closeness with the U.S., or this perceived closeness with the U.S., a setback for China's aims in that country and in the Southern Cone in general? Or are we seeing a coming around to China and Argentina that maybe would not have been anticipated? And then maybe a good sort of overall question for everyone. In your view, is Chinese influence in the region increasing or decreasing? And so I'll leave it at that, and perhaps I could turn to Ning first for some observations on any of those questions.
I guess I'll just briefly talk about the Chinese influence in the region based on my observation. Is that I think it's definitely increasing. I don't think there's any question about it. But the interesting question is, whether Chinese influence will, replace American influence, or will it fill in the gap of some of, what US is withdrawing from? That I'm not sure. My intuition is it's not. So a lot of these things that US does in Latin America, even though in this, in the current administration might no longer be engaging in, are in the traditional realm of international aid. So China, I don't see any sign of being either interested or capable of filling in the gap of the US. And in terms of providing security, like that's another important function of the United States in the region. I don't see China also has a lot of interest, even though this year they're talking more about cooperation on, related to drug, violence, smuggling, etc. But we don't know what China exactly could do. So I would say Chinese influence is increasing, mostly on the economic front. And there will be, I think, a slower but still increase in through people-to-people exchange. But in terms of providing other public goods, we will have to see whether China could be there one day.
Thank you, Ning. Eric?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, and Margaret, you've been talking about this for years, is that Latin American and South American countries have been calling on the United States, pleading with the United States to get more engaged, to focus less on immigration and to focus more on trade, investment, all the things that the Chinese are doing. And so when we talk about is the US stepping up or is the Chinese displacing, I don't think this is a Trump phenomenon. I think this is a phenomenon that we've been seeing for more than a decade, at least, if not longer. Where is the U.S.? They say they want to have this sphere of influence, but at the same time, they also don't want to be fully engaged. And so one of the things that we see in particularly in the EV space, so huge pushes in Chinese EVs in Mexico and Brazil and other places, manufacturing as well as sales and distribution, critical minerals, in the lithium triangle, obviously Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile being kind of the main focuses of that, but mining extending deep into Brazil as well. Lots of Chinese engagement. But we also saw this week the limits of Chinese engagement when Tsingshan backed out of a Chilean project because the price of lithium is just simply too low. And so one of the challenges now facing the United States is the fact that nickel, cobalt, lithium, many of the critical minerals, with the exception of copper, are at near decade lows. And so that's going to make it very, very difficult. One very important insight that I picked up from some Trafigura traders in Singapore earlier this year was that the Chinese are buying large quantities of these critical minerals, not for the auto industry, which is where we're mostly focused on, but for large-scale battery storage as part of Xi Jinping's 2050, 2060 carbon neutral pledges that he's made. And so you'll see even this massive buying of critical minerals in South America that goes completely counter to current cyclical pricing, which is like, why are you pumping out so much when prices are so low, in part because they're buying for different purposes, which is for large-scale battery storage. We don't see the U.S. coming into those sectors in any robust way. And so I think that much to the disappointment of a lot of regional governments who would love to have the choice and not be so reliant on China, as is the case in Brazil right now, where somewhere 80% of meat exports, for example, go to China. That's not a healthy dynamic, and I think they would like to see more presence from the U.S.
Thanks so much, Eric. Parsifal?
Okay. So a couple of things. This narrative that the U.S. forgot about Latin America it's way more complex than it's usually portrayed. To date, I think the latest numbers are from 2023. The U.S. stands for around 1/3 of all foreign direct investment in Latin America. China is around 1%. So it's simply not true that the U.S. simply completely disengaged. Where does this narrative come from? It comes from, I think, two areas. The first one is that where is that 1/3 of FDI going into? It's not going into infrastructure. It's not going into the areas that China does invest in, or at least its companies participate in. So expansion of ports, agro industries vary, but my point being that after the US, it's the European Union. stands for about 20% of the entire foreign direct investment in Latin America. So it's simply not true that, you know, the West has forgotten about the region and that China is just simply coming in. And it's still minimum what China invests in Latin America. What's the difference? You know, I think the PRC is much more effective of transmitting this. It stems from its, you know, US's own Washington politics and fears of China, you know, suddenly coming into the region and taking up spaces. I think it's much more noise than reality. That's the first thing. Second, I completely agree with Ning. Chinese influence, it's just gonna continue to grow in the coming years, but again, it's gonna be completely different. The fact that USA doesn't exist, China is nowhere to be found. It doesn't have an interest in filling these gaps left by the US. If we follow trends, and Margaret, you've done a lot of work on this. It's in specific areas. We see it's tech companies, we see infrastructure companies, we see EVs, we see solar panels, we see wind farms. And China's excess building capacity goes towards infrastructure. So it's like, you know, China and the US, there's obviously an overlap, but it's not like they're clashing in the areas they are investing in. And again, I think this has more to do with the perception have to do a lot more geopolitics, US-China tensions, than what is actually happening on the ground.
Thank you, Parsifal. And to close us out, Claudia?
Hi, thank you. No, I agree with Ning and with Parsifal that I think engagement of the United States and China in Latin America goes through different areas. I think China focuses on specific areas that the United States are not necessarily focused. Although I disagree with Eric with critical minerals. I think the US is increasingly looking to critical minerals in the region. I think there is a concern from the US side that China might lock access to critical minerals in the region, and the US doesn't want to see that. I think the US wants to have the access to critical minerals in the region. And regarding energy, this is one area of great Chinese engagement with Latin America. It's the area that receives most of Chinese investments in Brazil. 70% of Chinese investments in Brazil is in the energy sector, with a prominence of the electricity. And in the recent visit, I was surprised that we saw an increase in the scope of Chinese investment in this area. There was an agreement in biofuels, which China historically resisted a lot to the use of ethanol, and there was agreement to discuss the use of ethanol in all kinds of transportation, like land, air, and ocean. And there were two announcements of investments of Chinese companies to produce sustainable aviation fuel in Brazil, which is a new area of cooperation. So I think energy is definitely a sector that will continue to see Chinese engagement with Latin America. And we, during Lula's visit, actually the main announcements end up being announcements of business investments, not like huge infrastructure engagements from the Chinese government, but investments from Chinese companies. And there were announcements of roughly $5 billion of investments. And there was a new Meituan, which is the king of delivery in China. It's impossible to walk in a Chinese city without seeing hundreds of motor boys delivering Meituan merchandise. And they announced that they are entering in the Brazilian market. And there was these investments on energy, as I mentioned. So I think the engagement of the business sector is pretty much alive in the relationship between Brazil and China. And finally, to discuss the issue that first of all mentioned of that CELAC itself is much weaker than it used to be. And I think in his statement, Lula also mentioned that. He mentioned there is this lack of coordination, this lack of strategy of Latin America towards China or towards the United States. And in his statement, Lula mentioned that the Latin America, let me see, we cannot be on ourselves. We need a coordination in the country. And if you don't do that, we'll keep our position as we are today, as poor and outside the global, more connection to the global economy. So I think that is a main concern for the region.
Thank you so much, Claudia, and that's an excellent concluding point. Absolutely, integration and a common strategy will be fundamental moving forward. I can't thank our panelists enough for joining us and for the really terrific commentary. Thank you to our audience and for the excellent questions. And thank you so much again to our co-host, the Fundación Andrés Bello, for helping to organize this very important and timely event. We hope you'll join us for future sessions, and many thanks again and for your patience in running a bit over. Thank you all, and looking forward to seeing you soon.